It's time now for perspective. With war raging in Ukraine, Europe is grappling with the arrival of large numbers of refugees, just as it had to at the peak of the migrant crisis a few years ago, when it was mainly Syrians, Iraqis and Afghans seeking safety. My guest today is a man who knows firsthand what making that journey really means, leaving Kabul in 2016 to join his Afghan friend Omar on his quest to reach Europe. Matthieu Aikins is a journalist and author of The Naked Don't Fear the Water, which has also very recently been published in French under the title Les humbles ne craignent pas l'eau. Thank you very much indeed for being with us here on France 24 today.
Thank you for having me.
Can I start by asking you about one of the main protagonists of this book, Omar? How did you meet him and how did you eventually decide to journey with him as he tried to reach Europe?
Well, Omar was one of my very first friends in Afghanistan that I met after I went there in 2008 as a young journalist. And he had formerly been an interpreter with the US and Canadian military. So we worked together on some stories. And over the years, I got to know him and his family quite well as I was living in Kabul. And he'd always dreamed of emigrating from the West, a dream that got more urgent as the country descended into war and violence again. For a long time, his project had been to emigrate with one of the visas that the U.S. government gives to former Afghan and Iraqi employees, which he should have qualified for because he'd worked with the U.S. military, but he didn't have all the paperwork. So he was rejected in 2015, right at the moment where there was the crisis in the Mediterranean, where nearly 1 million people, migrants, passed into the European Union. Most of them were Syrian, but the second largest number were Afghans. So he was rejected at that moment for this visa, and he decided to take the smuggler's road to Europe. And I decided to go with him, and this book is the story of our journey.
And I'm assuming you expected the journey to be, at least in parts, perilous. What made you decide to go with him on that journey? And was it as perilous as you expected?
Well, the journey was definitely dangerous, and as a result, because of the danger of being arrested and separated or even kidnapped by our smugglers, the only way that I could really go with him on this route was to go undercover as an Afghan refugee myself. And that's something I was able to do because I have a half Asian background and I learned Persian while living in Afghanistan. So with the help of Omar, this friend who I trusted with my life, I was able to pass as an Afghan refugee, go undercover, leave behind my passport, and really see it from the inside. And of course, it was quite dangerous, but I always say that, it's not as dangerous as the wars that I was covering in these countries, and that's why people were willing to risk their lives to escape.
And you said just now you had to leave your passport behind in order to be a convincing Afghan refugee. What did that feel like? You're a Canadian citizen. What did it feel like to leave your passport and the protections that it afforded you behind?
It gives you a bit of a sense of vertigo, especially to hand yourself over to what are criminals, the smugglers. You become beholden to them, basically, and you feel very much like you're walking on a tightrope without a safety net. But that's the situation, of course, of all the people who are taking this route. And at the end of the day, as much as I travel with them, as even in the same boat as them, literally, I don't pretend to have understood what it's really like to be someone who doesn't have a passport, who doesn't have a refugee. Of course, I had, my background as a journalist to rely on if I had to.
And how was this all for your friend Omar, seeing you leave your passport behind? Because presumably he would have done almost anything to be in possession of a Canadian passport. Was that a source of tension at any point in your friendship as you made that journey together?
There were moments of tension between us with the different perspectives that we brought to the trip. It's very different to be doing this, out of necessity because you're seeking a better future, and to be doing this out of choice because you're seeking a good story. But at the end, I found that my role, I tried to approach this project as a kind of objective journalist and as an observer, and to step back and let Omar take the lead. But as I discussed in the book, that gradually became impossible as we got sucked deeper and deeper into this project of his migration, his family's migration. It became harder for me to be objective, and in the end, I was really involved in my friend's success and getting there, and our goals kind of became united.
And you've mentioned a few times the smugglers you met along your way. A lot of European politicians spending a lot of time saying that what we really need to do to make that journey safer, to deter people, is to dismantle those smuggling networks. What was your experience of the people smugglers that you met?
Well, look, smuggling is not a business that encourages honesty and kindness, and there's a lot of nasty treatment by some of these people. But at the end of the day, almost every refugee needs a smuggler to escape because they're not allowed to cross borders. Afghans have the worst passport in the world when it comes to visa-free travel. They're not allowed to leave their country, basically, without visas, without passports, which many of them don't have. So they need smugglers because of borders. So I think smugglers are a convenient scapegoat for politicians, but the truth is the borders create smugglers, and the harsher the border is, the more incentive there is for refugees to pay smugglers, the larger the smuggling industry grows. It's a bit like the war on drugs. You know, you have a dialectic between cops and police, and so the politicians with their harsh border laws are actually the ones who are creating greater profits for smugglers.
And at one point, you and Omar found yourself on the Greek island of Lesbos. What was that like? Can you take us through that experience? It's an experience we often hear about and very rarely get an inside track on.
Yeah, well, we had been dreading going to Lesbos because the camp on it, Moria, was at the time the largest, most notorious camp in Europe. It had actually burned to the ground in a fire that had been the result of a riot just beforehand. Before we arrived, so we tried to avoid it, but the smuggler tricked us and we landed on this island. It had been built for maybe 1,000 people, but it had been turned into, under the EU's new policy, if you remember in 2016, they made a deal with Turkey to stop refugee flows. So centerpiece of that policy was to turn the Greek islands into open-air prisons, in essence. So Moria had become a prison. It was rapidly filling up over capacity. There was 5,000 people there. They were living in the mud and in camping tents. There was long lineups for food, fights. You know, it was really kind of a Darwinian environment that pitted refugees against each other. So it was truly awful. But we were trapped there. We had to escape in order to move onward.
Now, you returned to Afghanistan in 2021 in June. We all know, of course, what happened after that, the chaotic weeks and months that ensued. What are your most vivid memories from the end of August, September, October in Afghanistan this year? Sorry, I should say last year.
It all happened so fast. I mean, I went back to Afghanistan this summer, not expecting that the government would collapse. And within a couple months, the Taliban were at the gates of Kabul. The whole system just vanished like a mirage. I mean, it was a house built on sand, absolutely. And the Afghan government collapsed. The internationals all ran for the airport. I, along with some other friends, we stayed behind to report on what was happening. So we witnessed thousands of people besieging this airport, desperate to escape, extreme levels of violence, you know, against these crowds. There was a suicide bombing that killed, you know, more than 100 people outside of the airport. It was just a really gruesome, tragic situation. But it's been followed by, I think, an even more alarming state of affairs in Afghanistan, which is that you have a population that's about half of the people there are now at risk of starvation, according to the United Nations. We created one of the most aid-dependent states in the world over 20 years in Afghanistan, and suddenly withdrawing that aid has had predictable consequences. The state is collapsing. The population is sort of being held hostage by a fundamentalist regime that's not even allowing girls to go back to school. So it's a very severe dilemma. There's not a lot of good options, but one of them is for Afghans is to migrate. So there's a whole new wave of Afghans who are leaving their country. I was at the border with Iran, you know, this fall. More than 1 million people have gone through that route, they estimate. And they're really facing an even worse situation than the one I experienced with my friend on this trip, because the borders have gotten harsher and the laws have gotten harsher since then.
Just one very last question, very quickly. Where are Omar and his family now?
They are now in Europe. I haven't used his real name or said exactly which country he's in, but they're doing well. And obviously, given what happened in Afghanistan this summer, he and I are very glad that he escaped when he could.
I'm delighted to hear it. Matthieu Aikins, author of Les Humbles ne craignent pas l'eau, in English, that is The Naked Don't Fear the Water. Thank you very much for speaking to us on France 24 today.
Thank you for having me.